There's a particular kind of silence that lives outside Buckingham Palace at 7:30 in the morning. Not peaceful silence. Not the kind you find in a park or a church. This is the silence of protocol, pressed, starched, held rigid the way a soldier holds his spine. It has weight to it. It has history. And, if you stand there long enough, you start to feel it pressing back against your chest. I'd been standing near the Victoria Memorial for 40 minutes that Tuesday morning. October. The kind of October where the sky can't make up its mind, gray and gold fighting each other in slow motion above them all. I had a coffee going cold in my hand and a press badge around my neck that felt more aspirational than accurate. Freelance. Which is just a polite way of saying hoping. I'd been tipped off the previous night. Nothing specific. Just a text from a contact inside the Palace Communications office, a woman I'd known for 3 years who owed me a favor and occasionally spent it this way. The message was 4 words. Morning shift. Cam's attending. That was it. No context. No time. No gate number. So I came early and I waited. The tourists had started arriving around 7. Mostly Asian tour groups at that hour, disciplined, coordinated, matching lanyards, phones raised like offerings. A family of Americans near the left gate with a double stroller and matching Oxford University hoodies that I'd bet my lunch money had never seen Oxford. A young woman in a yellow hijab sketching the gates in a small notebook, her pencil moving with a focus that made everyone else look like they were just passing through. The guards at the front were 2 that morning. I'd come enough times to recognize rhythms even when I didn't know names. The one on the left, let's call him the veteran, had the stillness of someone who had genuinely stopped existing in his body the moment he put on the bearskin. Face carved into place. Eyes that tracked without moving. Boots so perfectly planted you'd think they'd grown roots overnight into the forecourt stone. The one on the right was different. Not wrong, exactly. But different in the way a sentence is different when one word is slightly off, technically grammatically correct and somehow still jarring. He was young. Maybe 22. The bearskin sat a touch high on his forehead, or maybe his forehead was just longer than regulation anticipated. His gloves were immaculate. His posture was regulation. But there was something about the set of his jaw tight in a way that the veteran's wasn't. The veteran's jaw was loose from years of not reacting. The young one was working at not reacting. There's a difference. I noticed it the way you notice a violin slightly out of tune in an orchestra. You can't immediately name the problem. You just feel the friction. His name, I found out later, was Guardsman Daniel Forsyth. 23. Second full rotation at the palace. From a village outside Shropshire. His mum had driven down for his first official posting and stood right here, where the tourists stand now, and cried into her scarf. None of that was visible on his face that morning. None of it was supposed to be. At 8:14, the shift in atmosphere was palpable before anything actually changed. That's the thing about places like this, places built on ceremony. The change doesn't announce itself with noise. It announces itself with a different quality of attention. The 2 police officers near the side entrance straightened differently. A palace official in a dark coat appeared from nowhere and stood very still near the inner gate. One of the equerries, junior, young, aggressively forgettable in that way they're trained to be, walked through the forecourt at a pace that was measured to appear casual but wasn't. The tourists didn't notice any of this. I noticed it because it was my job to notice it. Because 4 words in a text message had brought me here before the croissant shops opened. And, then, the inner doors opened. She didn't sweep in. That's a word people use about royalty and it's usually wrong. Sweeping implies drama, implies performance, implies awareness of being watched. Queen Camilla walked out of those doors the way someone walks out of their own house, purposeful, slightly preoccupied, adjusting her gloves. She was in a wool coat. Camel-colored. A silk scarf at her neck in muted reds and golds that caught the October light in a way that probably hadn't been planned but absolutely looked like it had been. Low heels. A small burgundy bag. The reading glasses she doesn't always wear in public were perched on her nose, and she was looking at something in her hand: a card, a schedule, a note, with the expression of someone doing three things in their head simultaneously. Two ladies in waiting flanked her, a step behind and a step wide. The equerry materialized at her right shoulder. Two PPOs, personal protection officers, moved in that specific way PPOs move, which is to say they moved like the space around her had weight and they were managing the weight. She was heading toward the Royal Standard entrance. Routine. An engagement, I assumed, somewhere in the city. Flowers, handshakes, polite listening, ribbon cutting, the whole choreography that has its own vocabulary and its own kind of exhaustion. She would pass within 15 feet of the guard positions. She was passing within 15 feet of Daniel Forsyth, guardsman, 23 years old, jaw set like a lock nobody had the key to. This is where it starts. What I saw first was the hesitation. Not in her. In him. It was a fraction. A half second where something in Forsyth's posture did something it wasn't supposed to do. It didn't break, he didn't move, didn't turn his head, didn't flinch. But it shifted. Microscopic. The kind of shift that you would edit out in a film because an audience wouldn't believe it was real. I believed it. I'd been watching ceremonial guards for 6 years. I know what regulation stillness looks like and I know what performed stillness looks like. For 1/2 second, Daniel Forsyth was performing. Something had happened. I would find out later, much later, from a source who was there, standing close enough that I trust the account, that the stone beneath Forsyth's left boot was wet. Genuinely wet. A maintenance crew had cleaned that section of forecourt at 6 a.m. and the sun hadn't dried it yet. The patch was small, barely palm-sized, but it sat directly beneath his left heel. And at 8:16 on a Tuesday morning in October, with Queen Camilla 8 feet away and a PPO 2 feet to his left and a tourist with a camera already raised, Daniel Forsyth's left boot found that patch of wet stone. He didn't fall. Let me be clear about that. He did not fall. But he slipped. 1 inch. Maybe 2. A shift in weight so controlled and so immediate that it was less a slip and more a correction, the body catching itself before the mind finished processing the emergency. His right leg absorbed the shift. His back stayed vertical. His eyes stayed forward. His arms didn't move. And Queen Camilla saw it. Of course she did. She sees everything. Anyone who's spent time watching her at public engagements knows this about her. She has that particular kind of attention that looks unfocused until you realize it isn't. She was 8 feet away. She had been walking with the mild preoccupation of someone managing a morning schedule and, then, in the space of one breath, she wasn't preoccupied at all. She stopped. The equerry nearly walked into her back. The ladies in waiting stopped a beat after her, that practiced near collision that you develop after years of following someone who can stop without warning. One of the PPOs said something low. She didn't respond to it. She was looking at Forsyth. He was looking straight ahead. Eyes front. Chin parallel to the ground. The slip already reabsorbed, already returned to stillness, already, as far as his training was concerned, a thing that had not happened. She took 2 steps toward him. The equerry made a sound. Not a word. A sound. The specific sound of someone who has a schedule and is watching it develop a complication. She took a 3rd step. She was 4 feet from Forsyth now. Close enough that I could see his jaw tighten further, if that was even physically possible. Close enough that the tourists near the left rail began to notice something was happening. You could see it ripple through them, the shift from glazed sightseeing to alert attention, phones tilting toward this new development. She said something. I was too far to hear the words. I was close enough to see her face when she said them, and her face was not concerned, exactly. Not maternal. More like the expression of someone who has been watching something and has decided, with very little drama, to address it. Forsyth did not respond. Protocol. Sacred, immovable protocol. A guardsman on duty does not respond to address. Does not acknowledge. The tourists who shout at them, the children who wave, the grown adults who stand 2 inches from their faces and pull expressions, none of it registers. Cannot register. The job is to be a fixture, to be stone, to be the ceremonial manifestation of something larger than the individual inside the uniform. She knew this. She has known this for 26 years of royal life. She spoke again. The second time, her head tilted slightly. I've seen that tilt before, in old footage, in press engagements, at garden parties. It's the tilt that means she's not asking anymore. Not in an imperious way. Not in a command way. In the specific way of someone who has decided a particular formality needs to briefly yield to a particular reality. The veteran, I noticed, had not moved a single molecule. Eyes front. Elsewhere entirely. Forsyth was fighting something. You could see it if you were watching the way I was watching, if you knew what to look for. The infinitesimal tension around his eyes. Not distress. More like the specific mental effort of a man trying to hold 2 opposing instructions in his body simultaneously. Don't move. Don't respond. You are not here as a person. And, underneath it, the Queen is 4 feet away and she is speaking to me. She spoke a third time. And something happened to his face. Not much. A breath's worth of change. Something in the jaw released, not completely, not visibly to a tourist with a camera, but it released. His eyes, still forward, went somehow softer at the edges. And, very quietly, barely moving his lips, Guardsman Daniel Forsyth responded. The tourists lost their minds. Not loudly. Not all at once. But there was an audible ripple of reaction through the small crowd that had accumulated, low exclamations, pointed fingers. The urgent whispered, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" That becomes the sound of a moment becoming a memory in real time. One woman near the center barrier, 40s, sensible raincoat, northern English accent, said out loud to nobody in particular, "She's talking to him." She's actually talking to him. She was. And he was talking back. I couldn't hear the exchange. I want to be honest about that. Everything I'm telling you about what was said comes from what I pieced together afterward, from the accounts of people who were closer, the equerry, who was professional enough to say very little but human enough to say enough, a lady-in-waiting who has known me for 4 years and trusts me about as far as she can comfortably justify, and one of the PPOs who, after 2 glasses of wine at a function 3 weeks later, was slightly less professional than the job description recommends. What I can tell you is what it looked like. It looked like a woman who had noticed something was wrong and had decided, without asking anyone's permission, without checking whether it was on the schedule, to ask about it. It looked like a young man who had been trained to be invisible finding himself, for 90 seconds on a cold October morning, visible. And it looked like both of them were handling it with more grace than the situation had any right to expect. She left after 90 seconds. Maybe 100. She turned, rejoined her small convoy, and walked with the same purposeful stride toward the Royal Standard entrance. The equerry fell back into step. The ladies-in-waiting recalibrated. The PPOs resumed their geometry. She did not look back. Forsyth returned to absolute stillness. The tourist stood in confused silence for a moment, waiting to see if there was more. There wasn't. The moment folded up and tucked itself away the way moments at this place always do, absorbed into the institution, made part of its enormous unwritten history, already starting to be forgotten by everyone except the people who'd been in the right place to catch it. The woman in the sensible raincoat said, to nobody in particular, "Good for her." I wrote 3 words in my notebook. The equerry's name was Edward. I'm not going to use his surname. He would prefer I didn't, and I prefer sources who take my calls next time. We met at a wine bar near St. James's on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the morning at the palace. He came in the way people from that world come into ordinary places, slightly braced, like the ambient noise of civilian life is an ambient noise they have to consciously adjust to. He ordered sparkling water, changed it to still, changed it back to sparkling, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has been trained to reveal nothing and has decided to reveal slightly something. "I can't characterize her exact words," he said. "What can you do?" He turned his glass. I can tell you the nature of the exchange. That works. The whetstone, it turns out, had been flagged. Not formally. Not through any official channel. But, at 6:45 that morning, one of the senior guardsmen had noticed it during the pre-shift inspection and had said something to the duty officer, who had said something to someone else, and, somehow, through the specific bureaucratic alchemy of institutions that have existed for centuries, the information had not traveled the 6 inches it needed to travel to result in the whetstone being dried. So it was still wet at 8:14. Forsyth knew the stone was wet. He'd been told during shift briefing, actually told specifically watch the left heel section, it's still damp, and had positioned himself with his left boot just far enough back that he thought he was clear. He wasn't. The thing about that spot, Edward told me, is that the wet area was larger than it appeared. The surface looks dry from above. It's only at shoe level that you'd register the moisture. He paused. He seemed to be deciding something. She asked him if he was all right. I wrote that down. He didn't respond. Obviously. Which she anticipated. So she said, he paused again, and I could see the careful internal editing happening in real time, something to the effect that she noticed what had happened and wanted him to know she'd seen it and it had been handled well. Handled well. Her words, apparently. Or near enough. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it matters more than it first appears. Handled well. This is a woman who spent 26 years on the periphery of the most scrutinized family in the world before stepping to its center. She has sat in cars next to people who loathed her and smiled for photographs. She has walked into rooms where the murmur didn't stop when she entered. She has worn her dignity the way Forsyth wore that bearskin, not because it came naturally in every moment, but because the job required it, and she decided a long time ago that the job would be done properly. She looked at a 23-year-old kid from Shropshire who had slipped on whetstone in front of international tourists and a press pool and multiple cameras, and she said, handled well. Not are you all right? Not poor thing. Not the soft diminishment of sympathy. Handled well. Soldier to soldier. The language of someone who knows what it costs to stay upright when the ground betrays you. Forsyth, according to Edward, responded with 4 words. Thank you, Your Majesty. Just that. Barely moving his lips. Eyes still front. But, 4 words. Edward looked at his sparkling water. She smiled, he said. Small. And walked on. Here's what I didn't expect to learn. I didn't expect to learn that Daniel Forsyth nearly wasn't there that morning. I found this out through a different channel entirely, not Edward, not the lady-in-waiting, not the wine-loosened PPO. This came from a military contact, former Grenadier Guards, who still keeps in touch with people in the regiment and who called me, unprompted, 2 weeks after the incident because somehow the story had started moving through certain corridors in the way stories do. He put in for a transfer 3 weeks before, my contact told me. Not out of the Guards entirely. Just a different posting. Why? A pause. He's a private person. He won't want this talked about. I'm not naming sources. Another pause. His father was very ill. Is ill. It's the posting at the palace, it's an honor, obviously it's an honor, but it's also a commitment that doesn't flex for much. He'd been trying to find a way to be closer to home without losing the posting entirely. It wasn't going smoothly. I sat with that for a moment. And the transfer request? Declined. Respectfully, properly declined, but declined. He reported for duty on Tuesday as required. He stood on that whetstone on a Tuesday morning in October, having been declined and having shown up anyway. Having tucked whatever that cost him somewhere behind his sternum where the uniform couldn't see it. Having stood there with his jaw set in the way I'd noticed from 40 feet away without knowing any of this. The slip wasn't just a slip. It was the one moment his body told the truth in a morning full of holding. The consequences, the word in the title, the thing everyone who hears about this incident eventually asks about, the consequences were not what you'd expect if you're imagining consequences as punishment, as reprimand, as the grinding of an institution's gears over an individual who momentarily stood out. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, to my mind, considerably more interesting. For days after the incident, Forsyth's commanding officer received what is internally described in the regiment as a notation of commendation. Not a formal honor. Not a medal, not a ceremony, not anything that shows up on a public record. A notation. The kind of thing that lives in a file and is read by the right people at the right times. The notation, I never saw it directly, but the language was described to me by two separate sources who had acknowledged a specific incident of composure under unexpected circumstances and recommended it be considered in future posting assessments. It was not signed by Queen Camilla. The palace does not work that way. Nothing is ever traceable to a single moment of impulse or feeling. The machinery of the institution processes human moments and returns them as institutional language, properly attributed and properly distanced. But everyone who needed to understand understood. The second consequence was different. The whetstone was repaired. Not that week. Not in any rush. But, within a month, the maintenance records show, and I was shown the maintenance records, indirectly, which is the only way one is shown anything in this world, that the forecourt paving in the relevant section was relayed. The drainage gradient adjusted. The specific patch that had been wet on Tuesday mornings because of the angle of the morning clean runoff was corrected. This too had been flagged before. Multiple times, I was told. The flagging had been noted, acknowledged, entered into the appropriate queue, and deprioritized because the item was classified as a cosmetic concern rather than a safety issue. After October, it was reclassified. Nobody said why. Nobody needed to. The notation was in the file and the reclassification appeared in the queue and the maintenance team appeared with their equipment and the stone was relayed. That's how things work in places like this. An institution doesn't change because someone argues with it. It changes because someone with sufficient weight shifts their attention to a thing, briefly, and the thing is somehow, as if by the force of physics, moves. The third consequence was the one I didn't find out about until much later. Until, in fact, Forsyth's contact called me back 6 weeks after our first conversation, unprompted, on a Sunday afternoon when I was making rice and had my phone balanced against the kettle. The posting flexibility situation, he said, without greeting, without preamble. I turned down the heat under the rice. What about it? It got resolved. The transfer? Not a transfer. Different arrangement. There's a mechanism not widely used, not publicized, but it exists for guardsmen in exceptional circumstances to be attached to a secondary posting that allows for greater geographic flexibility. Rotating. The commitments are still met. The honor is still intact. And Forsyth got this arrangement. As of 3 weeks ago. A pause. He's been home twice since then. I stood in my kitchen with the rice going soft and the kettle slightly off balance and I thought about a 23-year-old from Shropshire standing on whetstone in October, and about the specific cost of staying upright, and about 4 words spoken barely above silence. Thank you, Your Majesty. And the machinery vast, slow, centuries old, largely indifferent, moving. I went back to the palace a week after my conversation with Edward. Not for a story. Or not exactly for a story. Partly just to stand there again and feel the weight of the silence and think about what I'd learned. The tourists were doing what tourists do. Matching lanyards, raised phones, double strollers. The young woman with the notebook wasn't there, she'd only been passing through, like all of us are only passing through. There were 2 guards at the front. I didn't recognize either of them. The gray October sky had resolved itself into something cleaner by that point, a thin winter sun working its way through cloud cover, making the gold on the gates look like something out of a story someone had decided to tell properly. I stood for a while. I thought about the difference between being seen and being noticed. Being seen happens whether you want it to or not. Being noticed, really noticed, with the specific attention of someone who has decided that what they are looking at matters is rarer than people think. Especially in institutions built around visibility, built around ritual, built around the careful, necessary pretense that everything is proceeding as planned. She noticed. She stopped. And, whatever the protocol said about what she was supposed to do next, she did the other thing. I've been asked, several times since, whether the story is really about Queen Camilla or really about Forsyth. The answer is it's about the gap between them. That brief, strange gap, 4 feet of October forecourt, 90 seconds of rule-breaking, 4 words returned barely above silence. The gap between a woman who has spent decades navigating the particular loneliness of being in that family, at that level, in that glass box, and a young man who showed up for a duty he didn't have to show up for and held it properly even when his body and his circumstances were both pulling at his sleeves. 2 people who knew, from different angles and different experiences and different altitudes, exactly what it costs to hold. And one of them looked at the other and said, with 4 words, in the language of people who have learned to hold, "I see you. You handled it well." Stories like this one don't travel in straight lines. They travel the way sound does in old stone buildings, unpredictably, finding corners you didn't know existed, arriving in rooms they weren't aimed at, carrying something of the original source even after several walls. I filed a piece. Small. Careful. No names I hadn't cleared, no details I couldn't verify, no speculation dressed up as fact. The kind of journalism that nobody reads the byline of but that exists as a matter of record, a documented moment in the enormous ongoing archive of the institution. What I didn't expect was the echo. It started, as most things start now, on a phone. Not my phone. Someone else's phone, belonging to a woman I don't know and have never met, who was standing near the right gate on that Tuesday morning in October and whose camera had been pointing, half by accident and half by the instinct that makes people point cameras at royalty, at approximately the right angle at approximately the right moment. She posted a 12-second clip. I don't know when she posted it, I only saw it 4 days after the fact, when a colleague sent me the link with a message that read only, "Isn't this your story?" 12 seconds. In those 12 seconds you can see, if you know what you're looking at, a woman in a camel coat stop walking. You can see her take 2, then 3 steps away from her original direction. You can see the faintest shift in the guard at the right position, barely anything, barely even visible unless you've already been told to look for it. And you can see her face, briefly, at an angle as she speaks. The clip had 400,000 views by the time I saw it. By the end of the week it had 3 million. The comments section was, as comments sections always are, approximately 40% of the population showing you their best selves and 60% showing you something considerably worse. But, the 40%, she stopped. She actually stopped for him. You can tell she genuinely noticed. This wasn't performance. She was already past him. Imagine having your hardest moment witnessed by someone who actually sees it. That's what kindness looks like when it doesn't need an audience. That last one had 11,000 likes by Thursday. I wrote it down in my notebook. Not for the piece. Just because it was right. There was a woman in Ohio, I know this because she wrote to the palace, and the letter eventually made its way through channels to someone who mentioned it to me as a footnote, who had watched the clip 6 times on a Wednesday evening and then sat down and written 2 pages by hand about her own father, who had been a veteran, who had held the same kind of stillness for the same kind of reasons, and who had never been seen by anyone in authority until it was too late to matter. She didn't send the letter expecting a reply. She sent it because watching those 12 seconds had put something in her chest that needed somewhere to go. I don't know if she got a reply. I hope she did. The clip reached the regiment, obviously. These things always do. There are people in every institution whose unofficial job is to monitor what the outside world is saying and relay it inward in a form that the institution can process without having to acknowledge that it monitors what the outside world is saying. The reaction inside the regiment was, I was told, approximately what you'd expect from a culture built on controlled expression and professional pride. Which is to say, nothing visible, and something considerable underneath. The senior guardsman who had flagged the whetstone at 6:45 that morning, the one whose flag had traveled the 6 insufficient inches, watched the clip at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and, reportedly, didn't say anything to his wife for 10 minutes afterward. His wife, who has been married to a soldier for 19 years and understands the value of not asking questions into certain silences, made another cup of tea. He said, eventually, he was good. She said, "Was it someone you know?" He said, "No." "Yes. In the way." She gave him his tea. Forsyth himself, and this is the part one sat on for longest, the part one nearly didn't include, found out about the clip not from the internet but from his mother. She called him on the Thursday. He'd been on duty Wednesday and hadn't been on his phone. She called at 7 in the morning, which is the time she always calls because she knows his schedule better than he does, and she said, "Daniel, there's a video." He said, "I know." He didn't know. He guessed from her voice. "You look very professional," she said. He said, "Mom." She said, "Your father watched it." And this is the part of the story that I'm not going to linger on, because it belongs to them and not to me and not to you. But I want you to know it exists, that there's a man in Shropshire who was ill and who watched a 12-second clip of his son on a Wednesday afternoon, and that the clip showed nothing that a stranger could name as courage but that a father watching his son's face would recognize immediately as the particular courage of a person who shows up when showing up is hard and holds the line when the line is all they have left. He watched it twice. His wife said he didn't speak for a while after. Some silences are full. I went back to the wine bar. Edward was already there. This time he'd committed to the sparkling water from the outset, which I took as a sign that he was more comfortable, or more tired, or both. He'd seen the clip, of course. He'd watched the comment threads. "How does she feel about it?" I asked. "About it being out there?" He looked at me carefully. "She doesn't comment on, I know she doesn't comment. I'm asking how she feels." A long pause. He turned his glass. "There's a word she used," he said finally. "In a different context, nothing to do with this specifically. But I've been thinking about it in connection with this." "What word?" "Proportionate." He said it the way people say words they've been carrying around for a few days, testing the weight of it, seeing if it still means what they think it means when said out loud. She uses it about royal duties sometimes. The idea that the response should match the moment. Not more. Not less. Proportionate. I thought about 4 steps toward a guardsman on wet stone. I thought about 90 seconds. I thought about handled well, and, for words back, and a smile that was small. "That tracks," I said. He nodded. "Yes. There's a version of this story that writes itself differently. A version where the emphasis falls on the irregularity, Queen breaks protocol, addresses guard, where the institutional transgression is the story, where the clip becomes fodder for the usual argument about the monarchy and relevance and whether the whole apparatus is justifiable in a modern world. That version gets written. Someone always writes it. But the version I kept coming back to, the one that sat with me on the train home and in the kitchen while the rice went soft, and in the weeks after when I found out about the notation and the stone and the posting arrangement and the father in Shropshire watching a 12-second clip twice in the afternoon, that version is about something smaller and also larger. It's about the fact that the cost of ceremony is paid in bodies. We don't talk about this enough. We talk about the grandeur and the history and the spectacle and the centuries of ritual, and we talk about the debates around all of that, and somewhere in all the talking we skip past the fact that there are people inside the spectacle. Real people who stand in uncomfortable boots on cold stone for hours at a time, who have been trained to not exist as individuals within the uniform, who carry their private lives, their sick fathers, their declined requests, their wet stones, completely invisible beneath the bearskin. And, mostly that invisibility is respected. Mostly the individuals inside the ceremony want the invisibility, take a certain pride in it, understand that the point is the institution, not the person. But there is a specific loneliness in being perfectly invisible to everyone in a place full of people looking directly at you. I think Queen Camilla knows something about that. I think that's why she stopped. Forsyth's posting arrangement, as of the last time I checked, is holding. He's been home 3 times. His father has had one good month and one difficult one, which is the rhythm of illness. It doesn't resolve, it oscillates, and you learn to find your footing on oscillating ground the way you learn to find it on wet stone. You adjust your weight. You stay vertical. You call it handled well. I filed my last follow-up piece in December. By then, the clip had drifted down in the algorithm, replaced by newer clips of newer moments, which is the natural life cycle of things that briefly break through the noise. The comment threads went quiet. The woman in Ohio presumably went back to her ordinary life, carrying whatever the letter had cleared out of her chest. The palace went on being the palace. The guards went on being the guards. The stone, newly laid, dried properly now. But here is what I want to leave you with, the thing that stayed with me longer than any specific detail, longer than the notation and the maintenance records and Edward's sparkling water and the father watching the clip twice. There's a particular quality of attention that most powerful people lose gradually and, then, all at once, the ability to really look at the person directly in front of them without the mediation of their own status, their own schedule, their own 17 competing priorities. It doesn't leave all at once. It erodes. In increments. Each incremental erosion is justified by something reasonably: time pressure, protocol, the sheer volume of people you're expected to acknowledge, the system that has evolved to mediate between you and direct human contact precisely because direct human contact at scale is impossible. The mediation becomes the mode. And then, one morning in October, on Whetstone, something breaks through the mediation. And you either notice or you don't. She noticed. 4 steps. 90 seconds. 4 words in return. A small smile. And then, the morning resumed, and the equerry fell back into step, and the engagement proceeded as scheduled, and the tourists went back to their photographs, and the institution absorbed the moment the way it absorbs all moments: enormous, impassive, unreadable from the outside. But the echo. The echo went outward. Into the clip and the comments and the woman in Ohio and the kitchen in Shropshire and the wine bar and the maintenance records and the posting arrangement and my notebook and now this, whatever this is. The echo is still going. That's the thing about sound in old stone buildings. It finds the rooms you didn't know existed. The Victoria Memorial was still catching the October light when I left that morning, 3 months ago now. Gold and gray in the clouds overhead. Cold enough that your breath did the visible thing, which always makes the whole city feel slightly more cinematic than it deserves to be. I stood for a minute at the bottom of the memorial steps and looked back at the palace and the forecourt and the 2 guards at the gate, whoever they were that morning, standing in the silence that has weight to it, the silence that presses back. I thought, somewhere inside that building a woman is reading a schedule and adjusting a pair of gloves and preparing to be measured and watched and critiqued and photographed and debated and interpreted and whatever else the day requires of her. And somewhere in Shropshire a man is watching a 12-second clip, maybe for the 3rd time now, and the thing he's watching isn't the Queen at all. He's watching his son's jaw. That set jaw. That held line. That small, invisible correction of weight onto a steadier boot. And he is watching it the way fathers watch things they have no adequate language for, not with the words for pride exactly, because pride isn't quite the right size, but with something that lives in the same neighborhood. Something that knows, bone deep, what it looks like when someone you love decides that showing up is worth the cost. And holds.